The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo di Marco stood before the ancient mirror that had witnessed centuries of Florentine power struggles. His reflection revealed a man transformed, no longer the naive merchant's son who had arrived in the city 5 years prior, but someone who understood that survival in the Renaissance political landscape required more than good intentions and honest commerce. The transformation had begun with a single, devastating betrayal. Lorenzo's former business partner, Alessandro Medici, had orchestrated the seizure of his family's trading empire through a web of forged documents, bribed officials, and calculated manipulation. In one swift stroke, Lorenzo had lost everything: his wealth, his reputation, and his faith in the inherent goodness of human nature. But, in that moment of complete vulnerability, he had discovered something far more valuable than gold: the understanding that true strength comes not from the absence of weakness, but from the conscious destruction of one's weaker self. This revelation led him to the works of Niccolò Machiavelli, whose writings on power and human nature had been gathering dust in the Laurentian library. As Lorenzo studied the Prince and other treatises, he began to see his catastrophic loss not as an ending, but as the most profound education he could have received. Machiavelli's central insight that the appearance of virtue often matters more than virtue itself, and that those who refuse to adapt to the realities of power will inevitably be crushed by those who do, became the foundation of his reconstruction. The first principle Lorenzo learned was that vulnerability is not an inherent weakness to be hidden, but raw material to be transformed. Every person carries within themselves two distinct versions: the weak self, driven by naive expectations and emotional reactions, and the strategic self, capable of clear-eyed assessment and calculated action. The weak self believes that fairness should naturally prevail, that good intentions will be recognized and rewarded, and that others will reciprocate honesty with honesty. The strategic self understands that power operates according to its own logic, indifferent to personal feelings or moral preferences. When Alessandro had orchestrated his downfall, Lorenzo's weak self had reacted with predictable patterns: outrage at the injustice, desperate attempts to appeal to mutual acquaintances for support, and emotional confrontations that only provided his enemy with more ammunition. Each reaction had been not only ineffective but actively counterproductive, reinforcing Alessandro's narrative that Lorenzo was an unstable and unreliable business partner who deserved his fate. The strategic self that began to emerge from this wreckage operated differently. Instead of viewing Alessandro's betrayal as a personal attack requiring an emotional response, Lorenzo learned to see it as valuable intelligence about how power actually functions. Alessandro had succeeded because he understood that in the realm of political and economic competition, perception often matters more than reality, and that the ability to shape narratives gives one tremendous advantage over those who rely solely on facts and logic. This understanding led to the first major tactical principle: the deliberate cultivation of strategic ambiguity about one's true capabilities and intentions. The weak self desires to be understood and appreciated for its authentic qualities, often revealing far too much about its thoughts, plans, and limitations. The strategic self recognizes that information is power, and that maintaining mystery about one's resources and intentions creates space for maneuver while preventing enemies from developing effective countermeasures. Lorenzo began implementing this principle in his daily interactions throughout Florence. When former associates inquired about his financial situation, instead of honestly detailing his losses, he developed a repertoire of responses that neither confirmed nor denied various possibilities. "The situation is fluid," he might say, or "I'm exploring several interesting opportunities." These statements were technically truthful while conveying the impression that he might possess hidden resources or backing. This strategic ambiguity served multiple purposes simultaneously. Potential allies, uncertain about his true position, were more likely to treat him with respect and consideration, hedging their bets in case he proved to have more power than was apparent. Enemies like Alessandro found it more difficult to deliver finishing blows when they couldn't be certain they had accurately assessed his remaining capabilities. And opportunities arose from unexpected quarters as people projected their own assumptions and desires onto his deliberately enigmatic position. The cultivation of strategic ambiguity extended beyond financial matters to every aspect of his persona. The weak self had always sought approval through displays of knowledge and competence, eager to prove its worth through detailed explanations and demonstrations. The strategic self understood that true authority often rests not on what one reveals, but on what one implies might exist beyond current visibility. By speaking less and listening more, by asking penetrating questions rather than providing comprehensive answers, Lorenzo began to develop a reputation for depth and insight that his previous, more transparent approach had never achieved. This transformation required a fundamental reorientation of his relationship with information. The weak self treated knowledge as a possession to be displayed, believing that sharing insights would create goodwill and demonstrate value. The strategic self recognized that information has different values depending on context, timing, and audience, and that the most powerful insights are often those that are carefully rationed rather than freely distributed. Lorenzo learned to categorize information into multiple levels of sensitivity and strategic value. Public information could be shared freely and even used to build rapport and credibility. Sensitive information required careful consideration of who might benefit from knowing it and how they might use it. Strategic information, insights that could affect the balance of power in ongoing situations, became his most carefully guarded resource, shared only when doing so would advance specific objectives or create particular obligations. This approach to information management naturally led to the second major tactical principle, the systematic cultivation of multiple sources of intelligence and influence. The weak self had relied primarily on direct, honest relationships, believing that straightforward dealing would naturally create a network of mutual support. The strategic self understood that power operates through complex webs of interconnected interests, and that effectiveness requires understanding and utilizing these networks rather than trying to operate outside them. Lorenzo began developing relationships with individuals not because he particularly liked them or shared their values, but because they occupied important positions in Florence's information and influence networks. The banker's clerk who processed commercial documentation became a source of intelligence about his competitors' financial situations. The archbishop's secretary provided insights into which noble families were gaining or losing church favor. The captain of the city guard's gambling debts created opportunities for both leverage and mutual benefit. These relationships required a completely different approach than the straightforward friendships the weak self had preferred. Instead of seeking personal connection or emotional satisfaction, Lorenzo focused on understanding each person's motivations, pressures, and opportunities. What did they need that he might be able to provide? What information did they have access to that might be valuable? How could mutual benefit be structured to create ongoing obligations rather than simple transactions? The development of these strategic relationships revealed another crucial insight: most people operate from positions of hidden vulnerability and unmet needs. The apparently powerful banker's clerk was deeply insecure about his humble origins and desperate for recognition from social superiors. The archbishop's secretary harbored ambitions for advancement within church hierarchy but lacked the family connections typically required. The guard captain's gambling problem had created financial pressures that his official salary couldn't address. By carefully observing and understanding these hidden dynamics, Lorenzo learned to offer precisely what each person most needed, but in ways that created ongoing obligation rather than simple gratitude. For the banker's clerk, this meant introducing him to minor nobles as my associate in commercial affairs, elevating his status through association. For the secretary, it meant providing information about church politics gathered from other sources that helped him anticipate and prepare for his superior's needs. For the guard captain, it meant not simply paying his gambling debts but creating opportunities for additional income through legitimate services. These interventions required significant investment of time and attention, but they created a web of relationships that provided both intelligence and influence far beyond what Lorenzo could have achieved through direct action alone. When Alessandro attempted to further damage his reputation through whispered allegations about his business practices, Lorenzo discovered these efforts almost immediately through his network. When opportunities arose for new commercial ventures, he learned about them before they became public knowledge. When political shifts threatened to affect commercial regulations, he received advance warning that allowed him to adjust his strategies accordingly. The cultivation of this network also provided protection against future betrayals of the type that had originally destroyed him. The weak self had been vulnerable because it had relied on a small number of direct relationships without understanding the broader context in which those relationships existed. Alessandro had been able to isolate and destroy him because Lorenzo had not developed alternative sources of support or information. The strategic self ensured that no single relationship or alliance was critical to his overall position, and that he maintained sufficient intelligence about potential threats to anticipate and counter them before they could cause serious damage. This distributed approach to relationships and information created what Machiavelli would have recognized as the foundation of sustainable power, the ability to operate effectively regardless of changes in specific circumstances or the actions of particular individuals. By avoiding dependence on any single source of support or intelligence, Lorenzo made himself much more difficult to attack successfully and much more likely to recognize and adapt to changing conditions. The third major tactical principle emerged from observing how successful political actors in Florence managed their public personas, the deliberate construction of a reputation that serves strategic purposes rather than simply reflecting authentic character traits. The weak self had believed that reputation should naturally flow from genuine qualities and actions, and that attempting to manage perception was somehow dishonest or manipulative. The strategic self recognized that in competitive environments, reputation is a crucial resource that must be actively cultivated and carefully managed. Lorenzo began studying how different types of reputation affected their bearers' opportunities and limitations. Merchants known for scrupulous honesty found it easier to establish new trading relationships but often struggled to negotiate advantageous terms because their predictability was taken for granted. Politicians famous for their principles commanded respect but frequently found themselves excluded from pragmatic compromises that required moral flexibility. Military leaders celebrated for their courage attracted followers but sometimes found their reputations constraining their strategic options when situations required patience or retreat. From these observations, Lorenzo concluded that the most effective reputations combine apparently contradictory elements that create what he came to think of as productive uncertainty. People should know enough about one's character and capabilities to trust in one's general competence and reliability, but should remain uncertain enough about specific reactions and limitations to avoid taking one's responses for granted. He began constructing his new public persona around this principle. In business negotiations, he established a reputation for fairness and reliability in fulfilling agreements, but also for unpredictability in terms of which negotiations he would enter and what terms he would accept. Potential partners learned they could trust him to honor his commitments, but they could never assume they understood his decision-making criteria or that approaches that had worked before would necessarily work again. This combination of reliability and unpredictability served multiple strategic purposes. The reliability aspect made him an attractive partner for people who needed assurance that agreements would be honored. The unpredictability aspect prevented others from developing standard approaches to managing or manipulating him. Together, these qualities created a reputation that opened opportunities while providing protection against exploitation. The construction of this reputation required careful attention to every interaction and communication. The weak self had responded to situations based on immediate emotional reactions and personal preferences, creating a pattern of behavior that others could easily predict and exploit. The strategic self understood that each action and statement contributed to an overall impression that would affect future opportunities and challenges. Lorenzo developed what he privately called reputation maintenance protocols for different types of situations. When dealing with direct challenges to his authority or position, he learned to respond with measured firmness that demonstrated strength without revealing the full extent of his capabilities or intentions. When offered opportunities that seemed too good to be true, he developed habits of careful investigation that became known as thoroughness rather than paranoia. When confronted with requests for favors or support, he created consistent criteria that appeared principled while actually serving his strategic interests. These protocols required significant self-discipline because they often conflicted with his immediate emotional responses or personal preferences. The weak self might have wanted to demonstrate generosity by agreeing to unreasonable requests, or to prove his intelligence by explaining his reasoning in detail, or to express his true feelings about particular people or situations. The strategic self recognized that such impulses, while understandable, often worked against his longer-term interests by creating vulnerabilities or limiting future options. The discipline required to maintain these protocols also contributed to his growing sense of personal power. The weak self had been at the mercy of his immediate reactions and emotions, responding to events based on how they made him feel rather than on strategic considerations. The strategic self developed the ability to choose responses based on their likely consequences rather than their immediate emotional satisfaction. This capacity for self-management became a source of confidence that was independent of external circumstances or other people's actions. As Lorenzo's reputation for strategic thinking and reliable judgment spread throughout Florence, he found that people began approaching him not just for specific transactions but for advice and perspective on complex situations. This consulting role provided additional opportunities to gather information, build relationships, and influence outcomes while maintaining the appearance of neutral helpfulness. By offering insights that proved valuable to others, he created obligations and goodwill that could be utilized when needed without appearing to demand specific favors in return. The evolution of his reputation also demonstrated another crucial insight: people's perceptions of power often matter more than the actual distribution of resources or capabilities. As Lorenzo became known as someone whose opinion was worth seeking and whose alliance was worth having, he found that others began treating him as if he possessed more influence than his formal position might have suggested. This perception of power then became a self-fulfilling prophecy, as people's behavior toward him created actual opportunities and influence. The culmination of these three tactical principles, strategic ambiguity, network cultivation, and reputation management, created what Lorenzo recognized as a new form of security. The weak self had sought safety through accumulation of resources and maintenance of good relationships with powerful people, not understanding that such external dependencies created vulnerability to events beyond his control. The strategic self had developed multiple overlapping sources of information, influence, and protection that made him much more resilient in the face of changing circumstances or deliberate attacks. When Alessandro, frustrated by his failure to deliver a complete knockout blow, attempted a second assault on Lorenzo's rebuilt position, the difference between the weak and strategic selves became dramatically clear. Alessandro's new strategy involved spreading rumors about Lorenzo's business practices and attempting to convince potential partners that he was unreliable and potentially dangerous to associate with. The weak self would have responded with emotional denials and desperate attempts to directly counter each specific allegation. The strategic self responded very differently. Instead of addressing Alessandro's campaign directly, Lorenzo used his network to gather detailed information about Alessandro's current financial situation, political connections, and business practices. He discovered that Alessandro had overextended himself in several ventures and was facing pressure from creditors, that his political support was more fragile than it appeared, and that his success in destroying Lorenzo had created enemies who feared they might be next on his list. Rather than attacking Alessandro directly, Lorenzo began a careful campaign of strategic information sharing. He ensured that Alessandro's creditors learned about risky aspects of his business ventures that they might not have been aware of. He provided Alessandro's political enemies with insights into his methods and intentions that made them more effective in their opposition. He subtly encouraged Alessandro's business competitors by sharing intelligence about his strategies and vulnerabilities. These actions were never traceable back to Lorenzo directly, and individually they appeared to be routine business communications or casual conversations. But, collectively, they created increasing pressure on Alessandro from multiple directions simultaneously. As his financial position became more precarious and his political support eroded, Alessandro found himself fighting battles on several fronts without being able to identify a single enemy to focus his retaliation against. The effectiveness of this approach demonstrated the power of indirect action over direct confrontation. The weak self's instinct for head-on collision with opponents typically leads to mutual damage and uncertain outcomes. The strategic self's preference for systematic pressure applied through multiple channels often achieves more complete victory with less risk and fewer resources. As Alessandro's position continued to deteriorate, an opportunity arose that perfectly illustrated the difference between weakness-based and strength-based approaches to revenge. Alessandro, now desperate for allies, approached Lorenzo through intermediaries to propose a reconciliation and potential partnership. The weak self would have viewed this as vindication and an opportunity to demonstrate magnanimity by graciously accepting the apology and moving forward. The strategic self saw the situation very differently. Alessandro's approach was not a genuine change of heart but a tactical retreat forced by circumstances. Accepting the reconciliation would provide Alessandro with breathing room to recover and, potentially, attack again when the situation improved. More importantly, it would demonstrate to others that betrayal of Lorenzo carried no permanent consequences, encouraging future attempts. Instead of accepting or rejecting the overture directly, Lorenzo crafted a response that appeared reasonable while actually increasing the pressure on Alessandro. He expressed willingness to discuss reconciliation but established conditions that would require Alessandro to provide detailed information about his business operations and political connections as evidence of good faith. These conditions appeared fair on the surface but would actually provide Lorenzo with intelligence that could be used to complete Alessandro's destruction. Alessandro, recognizing the trap but having few alternatives, was forced to choose between providing the requested information and abandoning any hope of reconciliation. Either choice served Lorenzo's interests. Providing the information would give Lorenzo the tools to finish him, while refusing would justify Lorenzo's rejection of reconciliation and allow him to continue his indirect campaign with enhanced moral authority. The resolution of this situation demonstrated another crucial insight about the transformation from weak self to strategic self. True strength often lies not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the ability to make their destruction serve larger strategic purposes. The weak self seeks revenge for emotional satisfaction and tends to stop when the immediate target has been sufficiently punished. The strategic self uses conflicts as opportunities to demonstrate principles, build alliances, and establish precedents that will affect future situations. Lorenzo's handling of Alessandro became a case study in strategic thinking that enhanced his reputation throughout Florence. People observed that he had not merely defeated an enemy but had done so in a way that reinforced important principles about reliability and consequences while providing a clear example of what happened to those who betrayed trust. This demonstration strengthened his position with existing allies while deterring potential future enemies. The transformation from weak self to strategic self had required approximately 3 years of consistent effort and discipline. During this period, Lorenzo had systematically identified and eliminated the thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral habits that had made him vulnerable to exploitation and destruction. He had replaced them with approaches that were based on clear-eyed assessment of power dynamics, systematic cultivation of advantages, and careful management of his public presence and private capabilities. The process had been neither quick nor easy. Breaking established patterns of thinking and behavior required constant vigilance and frequent course corrections. The weak self did not disappear voluntarily but had to be consciously overruled in situation after situation until the strategic self became the dominant mode of operation. Many times, Lorenzo had to force himself to act according to strategic principles when his immediate emotional responses pulled him in different directions. The discipline required for this transformation had unexpected benefits beyond the obvious increase in effectiveness and security. As Lorenzo developed greater control over his reactions and responses, he found that he experienced less anxiety and frustration in difficult situations. The weak self had been constantly at the mercy of external events and other people's actions, creating a chronic state of emotional volatility and stress. The strategic self maintained emotional equilibrium by focusing on what could be controlled and influenced rather than becoming upset about factors beyond his reach. This emotional stability contributed to his growing reputation for wisdom and sound judgment. People noticed that Lorenzo remained calm and thoughtful in situations that caused others to become anxious or reactive. They began seeking his perspective not only on business matters but on personal and political issues as well. This consulting role further enhanced his influence and provided additional opportunities to shape events in directions that served his interests. The success of Lorenzo's transformation attracted the attention of other ambitious individuals in Florence who recognized the value of his approach. Some attempted to copy his methods directly, but most failed because they tried to implement the external techniques without understanding the internal discipline required. The strategic self cannot be constructed simply by following a set of behavioral rules. It requires a fundamental shift in how one understands and relates to power, conflict, and human nature. Lorenzo began to understand that his transformation represented a specific application of more general principles that Machiavelli had identified in his studies of successful rulers and political actors. The ability to separate personal feelings from strategic calculations, the discipline to act according to long-term interests rather than immediate impulses, and the skill to navigate complex social and political networks were not unique to his particular situation but were essential capabilities for anyone who wanted to exercise meaningful influence in competitive environments. This realization led him to begin documenting his experiences and insights in a private journal that would later become the foundation for a treatise on strategic thinking for merchants and other private citizens. While Machiavelli had focused primarily on princes and other official rulers, Lorenzo recognized that the underlying principles applied equally to anyone who wanted to achieve and maintain independence in environments where others possessed superior formal authority or resources. The core insight that emerged from his analysis was that the destruction of the weak self was not about becoming cruel or abandoning moral principles, but about developing the intellectual and emotional sophistication necessary to operate effectively in complex social systems. The weak self's conception of morality was often simplistic and self-defeating, based on naive assumptions about how the world should work rather than clear-eyed understanding of how it actually functions. The strategic self could maintain ethical principles while implementing them in ways that accounted for the realities of human nature and power dynamics. Honesty, for example, remained valuable not as an absolute commitment to share all information with all people, but as a strategic choice to build trust with specific individuals in particular contexts. Loyalty could be maintained toward those who had earned it through their actions, while protection was sought against those who had demonstrated their willingness to betray trust when it served their interests. This sophisticated understanding of ethics allowed the strategic self to operate with moral clarity while avoiding the self-destructive naivety that had made the weak self vulnerable to exploitation. By understanding that moral principles must be implemented through effective strategies rather than good intentions alone, Lorenzo had developed the ability to serve his values while protecting himself against those who would take advantage of moral behavior. The completion of his transformation was marked not by a single dramatic event but by the gradual recognition that he had fundamentally changed how he understood and responded to challenges. When new difficulties arose, as they inevitably did in the complex world of Renaissance commerce and politics, Lorenzo found himself automatically analyzing them in strategic terms rather than reacting emotionally. He had developed what might be called strategic instincts that operated naturally rather than requiring conscious effort. These instincts included the ability to quickly assess the power dynamics and hidden interests in any situation, the habit of considering how actions and statements would affect his reputation and relationships, and the discipline to choose responses based on their likely consequences rather than their immediate emotional appeal. Most importantly, he had developed the confidence that came from knowing he could adapt to changing circumstances rather than being dependent on any particular set of conditions or relationships. The ultimate test of this transformation came when Lorenzo's success attracted the attention of the Medici family themselves, who began to view him as a potential threat to their commercial dominance in Florence. This represented a challenge of an entirely different magnitude than his conflict with Alessandro. The Medicis possessed not only vast financial resources but also extensive political connections and the ability to use official authority to advance their private interests. The weak self would have been terrified by this development and would likely have attempted either submission to avoid conflict or desperate appeals to fairness and justice. The strategic self recognized the situation as both a serious challenge and a significant opportunity. If he could successfully navigate the Medici's concerns while maintaining his independence, he would establish himself as a force to be respected rather than simply tolerated in Florentine commerce. Lorenzo's approach to this challenge demonstrated the full maturity of his strategic thinking. Instead of waiting for the Medicis to define the terms of engagement, he proactively sought a meeting with Cosimo de' Medici to discuss their mutual interests and concerns. This initiative accomplished several purposes simultaneously. It demonstrated respect for Medici power while refusing to be intimidated. It created an opportunity to gather intelligence about their specific concerns and intentions, and it allowed him to present his own perspective before their positions became fixed. The meeting itself became a masterpiece of strategic communication. Lorenzo acknowledged the Medici's legitimate interests in maintaining stability in Florentine commerce while explaining how his own success actually served those interests by creating healthy competition and innovation. He provided specific examples of how his business practices had improved standards throughout the merchant community and had attracted new trading partners to Florence. Most importantly, he demonstrated his understanding of broader political and economic trends that could benefit both their enterprises. Rather than simply defending his right to compete, Lorenzo positioned himself as a valuable ally whose success could enhance rather than threaten Medici interests. He proposed specific areas of potential cooperation that would benefit both parties while allowing each to maintain their independence and distinct approaches. By the end of the meeting, he had transformed the dynamic from potential enemy versus established power to strategic partner offering mutual benefit. The success of this negotiation represented the culmination of Lorenzo's journey from vulnerable victim to strategic actor. He had demonstrated the ability to turn apparent weakness into strength, to navigate complex power relationships without sacrificing his independence, and to create opportunities for advancement even when facing apparently superior opponents. The principles that guided this transformation, strategic ambiguity, network cultivation, reputation management, and the systematic replacement of emotional reactions with calculated responses, had proven their effectiveness across a wide range of challenges and circumstances. More importantly, they had created a foundation of capabilities and relationships that would continue to serve him regardless of future changes in the political and economic environment. Lorenzo's story illustrates the profound truth embedded in Machiavelli's observation that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. The destruction of weakness is not about becoming invulnerable to attack or immune to setbacks, but about developing the internal resources and external relationships necessary to adapt and thrive regardless of circumstances. It is about replacing dependence on favorable conditions with the ability to create favorable conditions, and replacing hope for protection from others with the capacity for self-protection. The weak self seeks security through external validation, accumulated resources, and faith in the goodness of others. These sources of security are inherently fragile because they depend on factors beyond one's direct control. The strategic self creates security through competence, adaptability, and systematic understanding of human nature and power dynamics. This form of security is much more robust because it is based on capabilities that remain useful across different situations and cannot be taken away by external action. The transformation Lorenzo achieved represents a specific application of universal principles that apply beyond the context of Renaissance commerce. In any competitive environment where multiple actors pursue conflicting interests, those who understand and adapt to the realities of power will have significant advantages over those who operate according to naive assumptions about fairness and reciprocity. This does not mean that ethical principles must be abandoned or that ruthless selfishness is the only path to success. Rather, it means that moral values must be implemented through sophisticated strategies that account for the complexities of human motivation and the realities of power relationships. The strategic self serves ethical principles more effectively than the weak self precisely because it understands how to protect and advance those principles in environments where others may not share them. The journey from weakness to strength is ultimately about developing the intellectual sophistication and emotional discipline necessary to operate effectively in complex social systems while maintaining one's fundamental values and achieving one's essential objectives. It requires the courage to see the world as it is rather than as one wishes it were, and the wisdom to respond to reality with appropriate strategies rather than futile protests against its unfairness. Lorenzo's transformation demonstrates that this journey, while demanding, is achievable for anyone willing to undertake the necessary work of self-examination, skill development, and disciplined practice. The reward is not merely personal success, but the deep satisfaction that comes from developing one's full potential as a thinking, strategic human being capable of shaping circumstances rather than merely reacting to them. In the end, Machiavelli's insight about destroying the weak self points toward a fundamental choice that each person must make, whether to remain vulnerable to the actions and decisions of others, or to develop the capabilities necessary for genuine independence and effective action. The weak self may seem more sympathetic and morally pure, but it ultimately serves neither oneself nor others effectively because it lacks the power to protect values or achieve meaningful objectives in competitive environments. The strategic self, forged through the conscious destruction of naive assumptions and emotional dependencies, possesses the clarity of vision and strength of will necessary to navigate complex challenges while maintaining ethical principles and achieving worthy goals. This transformation represents not the abandonment of humanity, but the full development of distinctly human capabilities for reasoning, planning, and strategic action that distinguish our species and make civilization possible. Lorenzo's story thus stands as both a specific historical example and a timeless illustration of principles that remain relevant wherever human beings compete for resources, status, and influence. The tactics may change with technological and social developments, but the fundamental dynamics of power, the importance of reputation and relationships, and the advantages of strategic thinking over emotional reaction remain constant features of human social life. The man who destroys his weak self achieves a form of invincibility not because he becomes impossible to harm, but because he develops the resilience and adaptability necessary to recover from setbacks and turn apparent defeats into eventual victories. This is the true meaning of Machiavellian strength, not the absence of vulnerability, but the transformation of vulnerability into strategic advantage through disciplined intelligence and systematic preparation. As Lorenzo stood once again before that ancient mirror in the Palazzo Vecchio, 5 years after his transformation began, he saw reflected not merely a successful merchant who had overcome adversity, but a human being who had fulfilled the essential human potential for strategic thought and effective action. The weak self that had once stood in that same spot had possessed good intentions and natural talents, but had lacked the sophistication necessary to protect and advance those qualities in a complex world. The strategic self that now looked back from the mirror had preserved everything valuable from his earlier incarnation while adding the capabilities necessary to thrive rather than merely survive in the endless competition that defines human social existence. This completion of the circle, from vulnerability through destruction to reconstruction and strength, represents the archetypal journey that awaits anyone willing to undertake the difficult but transformative work of destroying their weak self. The principles Lorenzo discovered and implemented provide a roadmap for this journey, but each person must travel the path individually, adapting the general insights to their particular circumstances and challenges. The reward for this effort is nothing less than the development of one's full potential as a strategic, ethical, and effective human being capable of shaping the world rather than being shaped by it.